The rain fell like silver needles against the glass towers of Gangnam, each drop catching the neon glow of a city that never truly slept. Somewhere in the labyrinth of steel and ambition, Kang Min-ho sat alone in his Hanamdong estate, a king in an empty castle. They called him the Viper of Gangnam, whispered his name in the back rooms of nightclubs and corporate boardrooms alike. Men feared him, women desired him, but none of them knew the truth that haunted his sleepless nights. For 3 years, Kang Min-ho had been broken in a way that no amount of power or money could fix. The doctors had examined him with clinical detachment, their tests revealing nothing, their medications useless. His body had simply stopped responding, as if some essential part of him had died and taken his ability to feel with it. He'd built an empire on ruthlessness and control, but what good was control when you couldn't even control your own flesh? The irony wasn't lost on him. The most desired man in Seoul's underworld couldn't desire anyone at all, until her, Adana Okafor, had entered his life 2 years ago with a resume that impressed him and a presence that unnerved him. She was Nigerian, brilliant, and utterly unafraid of him in ways that his Korean subordinates never were. Where others bowed and scraped, she met his eyes directly. Where others trembled at his silences, she filled them with efficiency and the occasional sharp observation that made him reassess his own strategies. She'd become indispensable to his legitimate business operations, the perfect executive secretary who somehow managed to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. But Min-ho kept his distance. He always kept his distance. It was safer that way, for everyone involved. Adana had learned to read the shadows in Kang Min-ho's eyes, the micro-expressions that flickered across his face before the mask of control slammed back into place. After 2 years as his executive secretary, she'd become fluent in the language of his silences, the meaning behind each curt nod, each dismissive wave of his hand. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance, this performance of perfect efficiency. Sometimes she wondered if he even saw her as human, or just another well-oiled component of his vast machinery. Tonight, though, she wasn't thinking about Kang Min-ho or his empire or the 1,000 small demands that filled her days. Tonight was hers. Club Eclipse in Gangnam pulsed with bass-heavy music that she could feel in her chest, in her bones, drowning out everything else. The lights strobed in patterns of blue and violet, transforming the dancers into moving shadows, and for the first time in months, Adana felt something close to free. She'd come alone, which her friends back in Lagos would have scolded her for, but Seoul felt different. Despite the language barriers and the occasional stares her dark skin attracted, she'd carved out a small life here. The club was packed with beautiful people, all of them chasing their own temporary escapes, and she let herself be just another body in the crowd, anonymous and unburdened. The soju had been a mistake. She realized somewhere around her 4th shot. She wasn't used to Korean alcohol, had underestimated its deceptive smoothness. The room tilted pleasantly, and she laughed at nothing in particular, feeling lighter than she had in years. Her phone buzzed in her clutch, and she ignored it. Whatever crisis needed managing could wait until Monday. Tonight, Adana Okafor was off duty, but the phone kept buzzing, insistent as a mosquito, until finally she pulled it out with an annoyed huff. The screen swam in her vision, and she had to blink several times to focus on the message. Kang Min-ho needed the Busan contract. Tonight, where was it? Her fingers fumbled over the keyboard as she typed back, the autocorrect doing heavy lifting her brain couldn't manage in her current state. "It's Saturday night," she wrote. "Can't this wait?" The response was immediate. "No, bring it to my home within the hour." Adana stared at the message, her alcohol-fogged mind slowly processing what he was asking. Kang Min-ho's Hanamdong estate was legendary, a fortress that few ever entered. In 2 years of working for him, she'd never been invited there, had never even driven past it. He kept his personal life sealed off with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to everything else, and now he wanted her to come there. Tonight, at 11 o'clock on a Saturday. A more sober version of herself would have questioned this, would have suggested he send a driver to her apartment for the file, would have done anything except agree to go to her boss's private residence while drunk and alone. But the soju had dissolved her usual caution, replacing it with a reckless sort of courage that whispered, "Why not?" "Fine," she typed. "Give me 40 minutes." She stumbled out of Club Eclipse into the cool night air, the rain that had threatened all evening, now beginning in earnest. Getting a taxi took longer than it should have, and by the time she arrived at the address he'd sent, her hair was damp, and her carefully applied makeup was probably running. She didn't care. Let the great Kang Minho see her as something other than the perfectly polished secretary who never had a hair out of place. The estate rose before her like something from a different era. All traditional Korean architecture merged with modern security systems. High walls surrounded the property, and cameras tracked her approach with mechanical precision. She pressed the intercom button, suddenly aware of how inappropriate this all was, how the soju courage was rapidly evaporating into something that felt more like dread. "Miss Okafor," his voice crackled through the speaker, sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Come in." The gate swung open silently, and she walked up the stone path toward the main house, her heels clicking against the wet pavement. The front door opened before she could knock, and then she was standing in Kang Minho's private domain, dripping rainwater onto his immaculate floors. He appeared from a doorway to her left, and for a moment, she couldn't reconcile this version of him with the man she saw every day at the office. Gone was the three-piece suit, replaced by simple black loungewear that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. His hair wasn't perfectly styled but fell slightly across his forehead, and his feet were bare against the heated floors. He looked younger like this, almost vulnerable, though that word seemed impossible when applied to Kang Minho. "You're drunk," he observed, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite identify. Not anger, not disappointment, something else entirely. "I'm off duty," she replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Or I was, until you decided you needed a contract at 11 on a Saturday night. Where is it?" Adana blinked, then looked down at her, hands, at the small clutch purse that contained her phone, her ID, some cash, and absolutely nothing else. The contract was sitting on her desk at the office, exactly where she'd left it Friday afternoon. "Oh," she said, and then started to laugh, because what else could she do? "It's at the office. I thought you meant you needed me to email it to you." Kang Minho stared at her, and she watched something flicker across his face, some emotion too quick to name. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not the cold, calculated smile he used in business meetings, but something real, something almost boyish. "You came all the way here, drunk, in the rain, without the one thing I asked you to bring." Adana felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I can go back and get it. Take a taxi to the office right now." "No," he said, and his voice had gone soft in a way she'd never heard before. "You're soaked. Come inside properly. I'll make tea." She should have left. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to apologize, call another taxi, retreat to the safety of her small apartment in Itaewon. But something in the way he looked at her, something raw and unguarded, kept her feet planted on his expensive floors. "Okay," she heard herself say. "Tea sounds good." He led her deeper into the house, through rooms that were stunning in their minimalist elegance. Everything was clean lines and muted colors, traditional Korean aesthetics meeting modern luxury. But despite the beauty, it felt empty, like a showroom rather than a home. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal touches that might reveal who Kang Minho was when he wasn't being the viper of Gangnam. The kitchen was all granite and steel, and she perched on a bar stool while he moved with surprising grace, heating water, selecting tea leaves from a collection that looked expensive and largely untouched. His hands were steady as he prepared the tea, and she found herself watching them, wondering what those hands had done, what violence they'd committed in service of his empire. "You're staring," he said without looking up. "You're different here," she replied. "In your home, less terrifying." That made him pause. He turned to face her, the tea forgotten for a moment. "Do I terrify you, Adana?" It was the first time he'd used her first name. At the office, she was always Miss Okafor, always kept at professional distance. Hearing her name in his voice, in this intimate setting, felt like crossing some invisible line. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not in the way you probably want. You're terrifying because I never know what you're thinking, what you're feeling. You're like a locked room, and I don't have the key." He handed her the tea, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The contact sent electricity up her arm, and she saw him react to it too, saw his pupils dilate slightly. "Maybe," he said quietly, I don't have the key either. The tea was perfect, warming her from the inside out, clearing some of the soju, fog from her mind. They sat in silence for a while, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of the office. This was something different, charged with possibilities neither of them seemed willing to name. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows, and Adana realized she was in no condition to travel home tonight. The thought should have alarmed her, but instead, she felt a strange sort of calm settling over her bones. "Tell me something real," she said suddenly. "Something you've never told anyone else." Kang Minho's jaw tightened, and she thought he would refuse, would shut down the way he always did when conversations threatened to become personal. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm broken, Adana. In ways you can't see, in ways the doctors can't fix. I've spent 3 years pretending to be whole, building my empire higher and higher, thinking that power could fill the emptiness. But it can't. Nothing can." "What happened?" she asked gently. 3 years ago. What broke you?" He looked away, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens visible through the kitchen windows. "Someone I trusted betrayed me. Sold information to my enemies that got people killed. People under my protection. I eliminated the threat, eliminated him, but something in me died that night too. I stopped being able to feel anything. No fear, no pleasure, no pain. Just this vast emptiness where my humanity used to be." Adana's heart ached for him, for this powerful man who'd locked himself away in an empty mansion because he no longer knew how to be human. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his. His skin was warm, and she felt him tense at the contact. "You're not broken," she said firmly. "You're hurt. There's a difference." He looked down at their joined hands, and something in his expression shifted. When he met her eyes again, there was heat there, a hunger that made her breath catch. "And then I hired you," he said. 2 years ago, you walked into my office with your credentials and your confidence, and for the first time since that night, I felt something. It terrified me. So I kept you at a distance, kept everything professional, safe. But tonight, seeing you here, in my home, laughing despite everything, I can't help but wonder what would happen if I stopped protecting myself. What would happen?" Adana whispered, her pulse racing. Instead of answering, Kang Minho stood, pulling her gently to her feet. They were close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could smell the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with rain and tea. He raised one hand to her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone with a tenderness that contradicted everything she knew about him. "This," he murmured, "this would happen." When his lips met hers, it wasn't the aggressive claiming she might have expected from a man like him. Instead, it was searching, almost hesitant, as if he were afraid she might disappear if he held her too tightly. Adana's hands found their way to his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palms, proof that he was very much alive, very much human despite his claims of emptiness. The kiss deepened, and she felt 3 years of denial and loneliness pouring out of him. His hands tangled in her damp hair, and she pressed closer, wanting to chase away the shadows she'd seen in his eyes, wanting to prove to him that he wasn't as broken as he believed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw something close to wonder on his face. "I can feel," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "For the first time in 3 years, I can actually feel. Then feel this," Adana whispered, and kissed him again. The night unfolded in a blur of sensation and discovery. Minho led her through his empty house to a bedroom that was all dark wood and white linens, elegant and impersonal, except for the way he looked at her, as if she were the only real thing in his carefully constructed world. They moved together with the urgency of people who'd been starving without realizing it, and Adana discovered that beneath his controlled exterior, Kang Minho was a man capable of profound passion. He touched her with reverence, as if mapping territory he'd thought forever lost to him. Every kiss, every caress, seemed designed to prove to himself that he was still capable of this connection, this intimacy. And Adana, who'd spent 2 years as nothing more than an efficient assistant, allowed herself to be fully seen, fully wanted. When he whispered her name against her skin, it sounded like a prayer, like salvation. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, the rain still falling outside, creating a cocoon of sound that separated them from the rest of the world. Minho's fingers traced idle patterns on her shoulder, and she could feel his heart still racing against her back. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For reminding me what it feels like to be alive." Adana turned in his arms to face him, studying the planes of his face in the dim light filtering through the windows. "What happens now?" she asked. "When Monday comes and we're back in the office, what are we then?" Something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been fear. "I don't know," he admitted. "This is complicated. My world, my business, the things I'm involved in, they're dangerous. Being close to me puts a target on your back. I'm a grown woman, Minho. I can make my own choices about risk." "Can you?" he challenged gently. "Can you really understand what you'd be signing up for? The things I've done, the enemies I've made, they don't play by normal rules." "Neither do I," she replied. 2 years ago, I left everything I knew to start over in a country where I didn't speak the language, where people stared at me like I was an alien. I built a life here anyway. I'm stronger than you think." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I never doubted your strength, Adana. I doubt my ability to keep you safe." "Then don't keep me safe," she whispered. "Just let me in." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and for the first time in years, Kang Minho slept without nightmares. Morning came too quickly, sunlight streaming through the windows to paint the room in shades of gold. Adana woke first, her head throbbing slightly from the residual effects of the soju, her body deliciously sore in ways that made her blush. Beside her, Minho slept with his face relaxed, looking younger and more peaceful than she'd ever seen him. The notorious viper of Gangnam, vulnerable in sleep. She should have felt panic, should have been scrambling to dress and leave before things became awkward. But instead, she felt oddly content, as if something that had been out of place for a long time had finally clicked into position. Still, reality was waiting outside this room, and they couldn't hide from it forever. As, if sensing her thoughts, Minho's eyes opened, focusing on her immediately. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Adana wondered if he would regret this, if the cold businessman would reassert himself and dismiss her from his home and his life. But then he smiled, that real smile she'd glimpsed the night before, and reached out to tuck a strand of her hair behind her ear. "Good morning," he said simply. "Good morning. Regrets?" She considered the question seriously. "No," she replied. "You?" "None," he said firmly. "Though I'm fairly certain I should have a few. They should probably talk about what this meant, establish boundaries, figure out how to navigate the professional complications." But instead, Minho pulled her back down into the bedding, kissing her slowly, thoroughly, as if they had all the time in the world. And maybe, Adana thought as she surrendered to the moment, maybe they did. The next few weeks existed in a strange sort of limbo. At the office, they maintained perfect professionalism. Adana remained the efficient executive secretary, anticipating his needs, managing his schedule, speaking to him with the same respectful formality she always had. But now there were secret smiles, brief touches when no one was looking, the knowledge of what waited for them once the workday ended. Minho's apartment in Hanam-dong became their sanctuary, the only place where they could drop their masks and simply be. He cooked for her, terrible Korean fusion attempts that made her laugh, and eventually teach him how to make proper Nigerian jollof rice. She learned about his childhood, about the father who'd built the foundation of his empire through legitimate business before dying and leaving Minho to navigate the darker currents that had always lurked beneath the surface. He learned about Lagos, about her family who still didn't quite understand why she'd chosen Seoul over London or New York, about her dreams of eventually starting her own consulting firm. They were careful. Minho's enemies were always watching, always looking for weaknesses they could exploit, and he had no intention of painting a target on Adana's back. His driver dropped her off blocks away from his estate. They never appeared together in public. At the office, their relationship remained invisible to the carefully watching eyes of his employees and competitors. It should have felt like a burden, this constant secrecy, but instead, it felt like they were building something precious in the shadows, something that belonged only to them. A month into their hidden relationship, Adana woke in Minho's bed feeling distinctly unwell. The room spun when she sat up, and she barely made it to the bathroom before her stomach revolted. Minho found her there, holding her hair back with one hand while the other rubbed soothing circles on her back. Food poisoning, he diagnosed with concern. I'm calling my doctor, but it wasn't food poisoning. As the days passed and the nausea persisted, occurring with predictable regularity each morning, a cold certainty settled in Adana's chest. She bought a pregnancy test from a pharmacy in Itaewon, far from Gangnam where someone might recognize her, and took it in the bathroom of a cafe, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the stick steady. 3 minutes later, her entire world shifted on its axis. Positive, and not just once, but 3 times, because she bought 3 different brands, certain that the first 2 must be wrong, but they all said the same thing. Those little pink lines or digital words that seemed too small to contain such enormous implications. Pregnant. She was pregnant with Kang Minho's child. Adana sat in that cafe bathroom for what felt like hours, her mind spinning through scenarios and possibilities. How far along was she? When had it happened? That first night, probably, when they'd been too desperate for each other to think about protection. Or maybe one of the dozen nights that had followed when they'd been more careful but not careful enough. She thought about her career, about the consulting firm she'd been saving to start. She thought about Minho's dangerous world, about enemies who would see a child as the ultimate leverage. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone just last week, asking when she'd find a nice man to settle down with, and nearly laughed at the irony. A nice man. She'd fallen for the Viper of Gangnam instead. But beneath the fear and the shock, there was something else, a tiny spark of joy, unexpected and fierce. She'd spent so much of her life being responsible, being careful, following all the rules. And now here she was, pregnant by a man who lived in shadows, facing an uncertain future, and some reckless part of her whispered that maybe this was exactly where she was supposed to be. She needed to tell him. The thought terrified her, but Minho deserved to know. They'd figure it out together, just like they'd figured out everything else. She left the cafe with the pregnancy tests, wrapped carefully in tissue at the bottom of her purse, already planning what she would say, how she would break the news. That evening, she went to his estate as usual, let herself in with the key he'd given her the week before, a gesture of trust that had made her chest tight with emotion. She found him in his study, surrounded by papers and computer screens, managing the legitimate and not-so-legitimate aspects of his empire. He looked up when she entered, and his face softened immediately. The Viper of Gangnam becoming simply Minho, the man who'd held her through nightmares and made her laugh with his terrible cooking. "You're late," he said, but there was no reproach in it, only affection. "I was beginning to worry. Sorry, I had some errands to run. Minho, we need to talk about something." He must have heard something in her voice because his attention sharpened immediately. "What's wrong?" Adana opened her mouth to tell him, to share the news that would change both their lives irrevocably. But before she could speak, his phone rang, the specific tone he'd set for his second-in-command. He glanced at it, then back at her. "I need to take this. Business emergency. Can you give me 10 minutes? She nodded, and he answered the call, his voice shifting into the clipped, authoritative tone he used for his organization. She wandered out of the study, intending to wait in the living room, but found herself drawn to the kitchen instead, thinking she'd make tea while he finished his call. That's when she heard his voice carrying from the study, loud enough that he must have forgotten to close the door fully. She froze, not meaning to eavesdrop, but unable to move once she registered what he was saying. "The secretary?" His voice was dismissive, almost amused. "Adana? No, she's not my type, Junho. It's just convenient, that's all. Someone available without complications. I'll end it soon enough, once I get bored." The words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully placed to cause maximum damage. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the roaring in her ears. The pregnancy tests felt heavy in her purse, suddenly meaningless. She'd been planning to tell him about their child, about the future she'd allowed herself to imagine, and he'd been categorizing her as a temporary convenience, something to alleviate boredom. Adana's hand unconsciously moved to her stomach, to the tiny life growing there that he didn't know about and now would never know about if she had anything to say about it. She thought about all the tender moments, the vulnerability he'd shown her, the way he'd looked at her like she was his salvation. Had it all been a lie? Or had she simply been foolish enough to mistake good sex and temporary companionship for something deeper? She didn't remember walking to the foyer, didn't remember pulling on her shoes or grabbing her coat. Her body moved on, autopilot, driven by a survival instinct that overrode the pain threatening to drown her. Get out, get away, protect yourself, protect the baby, the baby. God, she was going to have a baby, and the father had just dismissed her as not his type, as a convenience soon to be discarded. The absurdity of it might have been funny if it didn't hurt so much. She was halfway down the driveway when she heard him calling her name. Adana, wait! Where are you going? She didn't turn around, didn't slow down. A taxi was approaching on the street beyond the gates, as if the universe had decided to grant her this one mercy. She flagged it down desperately, climbing in before Minho could reach her. The last thing she saw before the taxi pulled away was him standing in the rain that had started falling again, confusion, and something that might have been panic on his face. Go, she told the driver in Korean, her accent thick with unshed tears. Just go, anywhere but here. The next days passed in a fog. Adana called in sick to work, something she'd never done in 2 years, and holed up in her small Itaewon apartment. Her phone rang constantly, Minho's name flashing on the screen over and over until she finally blocked his number. He sent emails that she deleted unread. He even appeared at her apartment building, but she refused to answer the intercom, watching from her window as he finally left after an hour of trying. She couldn't face him, couldn't face the questions or the explanations or the lies, because that's what they'd been, she told herself firmly. Lies dressed up as vulnerability, as connection. She'd been a fool to believe that someone like Kang Minho could truly care for someone like her. She was foreign, expendable, not his type, but the baby growing inside her was real, even if his feelings hadn't been. Adana went to a doctor, got confirmation that she was indeed pregnant, and listened in a daze, as the ultrasound technician pointed out, not 1, not 2, but 3 tiny heartbeats on the screen. Triplets. She was having triplets. The technician smiled brightly, congratulating her, asking about the father, and Adana smiled back automatically while inside she was screaming. How was she supposed to raise 3 children alone? How was she supposed to afford this, manage this, survive this? Her savings would barely cover a year of maternity leave, let alone the cost of 3 babies. But as she stared at the ultrasound images, at the 3 tiny forms that would become her children, Chisholm, Amara, and Dubem, though she didn't know their names yet, she felt that fierce spark of joy ignite again, stronger this time. These were her babies, hers, and she would figure it out, just like she'd figured out everything else in her life. She didn't need Kang Minho. She didn't need anyone. 2 weeks after overhearing that devastating phone call, Adana submitted her resignation via email. She didn't give reasons, didn't offer to work a notice period, simply stated that effective immediately, she would no longer be serving as executive secretary to Kang Minho. Then, she began the process of disappearing. It wasn't as hard as she'd feared. Seoul was a massive city, and she'd always kept her life relatively private. She broke her lease, forfeiting her deposit, and found a new apartment in Incheon, close enough to Seoul for work opportunities, but far enough to avoid accidental encounters. She changed her phone number, created new email addresses, scrubbed her social media presence. Within a month, Adana Okafor had effectively vanished from Kang Minho's world, taking his children with her. She didn't know that he was tearing apart Seoul looking for her, calling in every favor, mobilizing his entire organization in a desperate search. She didn't know that he'd figured out what he'd done wrong, that Junho had eventually confessed to leaving the study door open during that call, that Minho had spent days trying to explain that the words had been a lie told to protect her from Junho's suspicions. She didn't know that the great viper of Gangnam had been brought to his knees by the absence of one woman. She didn't know because she didn't want to know. Knowing would make her weak, would make her question her decision, and she couldn't afford weakness. Not now, not when she was the only thing standing between her babies and an uncertain world. The pregnancy was difficult. Carrying triplets took a toll on her body that she hadn't anticipated. She found work doing freelance consulting from home, enough to keep the bills paid but not enough to save. Her mother called from Lagos, sensing something wrong, and Adana lied smoothly, saying everything was fine, work was busy, Seoul was wonderful. She couldn't tell her family the truth, couldn't bear the disappointment or the questions or the inevitable suggestions that she come home. This was her mess. She would handle it alone. The months crawled by, her body swelling with new life, even as she felt parts of herself dying from loneliness. She'd made acquaintances in Seoul, but no real friends, no one she trusted enough to confide in. The nights were the worst, lying awake in her narrow bed, feeling 3 tiny humans moving inside her, wondering what she would tell them when they asked about their father. Would she tell them the truth? That he'd been a powerful man who'd seen her as a convenience? Or would she lie, construct some gentler fiction to protect them from rejection? She was 8 months pregnant when her water broke in the middle of a thunderstorm. The pain came fast and hard, and she barely managed to call an ambulance before contractions overwhelmed her ability to think. The ride to Asan Medical Center was a blur of sirens and agony, and she arrived at the emergency room already dilating, the babies apparently as eager to enter the world as she was to meet them. The delivery was complicated, triplets often were, but through the pain and the fear and the exhaustion, Adana held on to one thought. Soon she would meet them. Soon she would hold them. Soon she wouldn't be alone anymore. Chisom came first, screaming his indignation at being pulled from the warmth he'd known. Then, Amara, quieter but with eyes that seemed to see everything even in those first moments. Finally Dubem, the smallest but somehow the fiercest, making his presence known with impressive lung capacity. 3 perfect babies, each with a shock of black hair and features that blended her Nigerian heritage with their father's Korean genetics in ways that made her heart ache. She'd made the right choice, she told herself as she held them for the first time. This was worth it. They were worth it. Even if she had to do it alone, even if Kang Min-ho never knew they existed, these 3 miracles were worth every moment of pain and fear and loneliness. But as she lay in her hospital bed that night, triplets sleeping in their bassinets beside her, Adana allowed herself one moment of weakness. She wondered where Minho was, what he was doing, if he ever thought about her. She wondered what he would say if he could see these 3 tiny humans they'd created together. Would he care? Would he want them? Or would they be just another inconvenience in his carefully ordered life? She would never know, and that was probably for the best. Tomorrow she would be strong again. Tomorrow she would figure out how to care for 3 infants alone. Tomorrow she would start building the life she and her children deserved. But tonight, just for tonight, she let herself grieve for what might have been. 3 years passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small victories. Adana discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, juggling freelance work with childcare, learning to function on minimal sleep, mastering the complex logistics of managing 3 toddlers. Chisom grew into a thoughtful boy who watched everything with serious eyes. Amara became the peacemaker, always trying to smooth over conflicts between her brothers. And Dubem, true to his fierce beginning, approached life with a fearlessness that terrified and delighted her in equal measure. Money was always tight. Adana's consulting work paid the bills, but there was never enough left over for savings or emergencies. She lived in constant awareness that one major crisis could topple the precarious stability she'd built, but she was managing. Barely, but managing nonetheless. She never told the children about their father. When they asked, which they did with increasing frequency as they grew older, she deflected with vague statements about him living far away, about complicated adult situations they'd understand when they were older. It felt like a betrayal of them, these lies of omission. But how could she explain Kang Min-ho? How could she make them understand that their father was a man who lived in shadows, who'd seen their mother as disposable? Seoul had become home in ways Adana hadn't expected. She'd learned the language fluently, made friends with other mothers at the children's preschool, carved out a small but meaningful life. Sometimes, she saw news about Kang Min-ho's business empire, read articles about his legitimate enterprises expanding, saw photos of him at charity galas looking as cold and untouchable as ever. Those moments hurt less as time passed, the wound scarring over if never quite healing. She thought she'd successfully escaped him, thought she'd built a life separate from his influence. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It started with Dubem's fever. At first, Adana thought it was just a normal childhood illness, something that would pass with rest and medicine. But when the fever spiked to dangerous levels and he began having trouble breathing, she rushed him to the emergency room at Asan Medical Center, the same hospital where she'd given birth 3 years earlier. The doctors admitted him immediately. talking about pneumonia and weakened immune systems, running tests and hooking him up to machines that beeped with mechanical precision. Adana sat by his bedside, holding his small hand, Chisholm and Amara confused and frightened in the chairs beside her. It would be okay, she told them, even as fear clawed at her chest. Dubem was strong. He would be fine. She was so focused on her son that she didn't notice the commotion in the hallway, didn't register the voice speaking in low, urgent tones to the nurses. It wasn't until the door to Dubem's room opened and a familiar figure stepped inside that her entire world tilted sideways. Kang Min-ho stood in the doorway, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. He looked older than she remembered, new lines around his eyes and mouth, his hair longer than he used to wear it. But it was unmistakably him, the Viper of Gangnam, and he was staring at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Then his gaze shifted to the children, to Chisholm and Amara sitting wide-eyed in their chairs, to Dubem lying small and pale in the hospital bed. She watched him take in their faces, the unmistakable blend of her features and his, watched the exact moment understanding crashed over him like a wave. "You," he said, his voice hoarse. "You were pregnant." It wasn't a question, but Adana found herself nodding anyway, her body responding even as her mind screamed at her to throw him out, to protect her children from this man who'd broken her heart. "Yes," she whispered. "3," Minho said, still staring at the children with something close to wonder. "You had triplets. My children. These are my children." Chisholm, always the brave one, stood up and positioned himself between his mother and this stranger, his small body radiating protective fury. "You need to leave," he said in Korean, his child's voice trying for authority. "You're making our mother upset." The look on Minho's face at those words was devastating, a mixture of pride and pain and regret so intense that Adana almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I'm not here to upset anyone," he said gently, crouching down to Chisholm's level. "I'm here because I own this hospital, and I was notified when Adana Okafor was admitted with her son. I had no idea that son was mine." "You don't own them," Adana said fiercely, finding her voice. "You don't own us. You have no rights here." Minho rose slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know," he said quietly. "I know I have no rights. Adana, I know I don't deserve to even be in the same room as you after what I did. But please, please let me help. Your son is sick, and I have resources. I have access to the best doctors. I can make sure he gets everything he needs." "We don't need your help," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word, betraying her. Because the truth was, she did need help. Medical bills were piling up, her insurance had limits, and if Dubem needed specialized treatment, she didn't know how she would pay for it. "Yes, you do," Minho said, and there was no arrogance in it, just sad certainty. "And I need to do this, Adana. I need to help them. Please." She wanted to refuse. Pride demanded she refuse. But then she looked at Dubem, at her baby struggling to breathe, and pride seemed less important than his life. "Fine," she said stiffly, "but only for them. Not for you, not for me. For them." "For them," he agreed. True to his word, Kang Minho mobilized resources with frightening efficiency. Within hours, a team of specialists was reviewing Dubem's case, adjusting his treatment, bringing in equipment that the hospital apparently hadn't thought to use. He never questioned the bills, simply ensured that everything was covered, that Adana didn't have to worry about cost while her son fought for his life. But he also didn't leave. Day after day, Minho appeared at the hospital, sitting quietly in the corner of Dubem's room, watching the children with a hunger that made Adana's chest tight. He brought toys that Chisholm and Amara initially refused before curiosity won out. He arranged for meals to be delivered so Adana didn't have to survive on vending machine, coffee, and hospital cafeteria food. He was there, constantly, undeniably present in a way he'd never been before. On the 4th day, when Dubem was finally improving and sleeping peacefully, Minho approached Adana in the hospital corridor. She'd gone out to get air, to escape the antiseptic smell and the beeping machines for just a few minutes. He found her by the window overlooking the Seoul skyline, her arms wrapped around herself as if holding herself together. "I need to explain," he said without preamble, "about what you heard that night." "I don't want to hear it," Adana replied, not looking at him. "It doesn't matter anymore. It matters to me. Adana, please, just listen." The door was open. "I didn't know. But Junho heard us the night before, suspected something was happening. He was testing me, pushing to see if I'd admit to having a relationship that could be used against me, so I lied. I said exactly what he needed to hear to make him think you meant nothing, but you meant everything. You still mean everything. Convenient excuse, she said bitterly. 3 years too late. I looked for you, Minho said, and there was genuine pain in his voice. For months, I tore this city apart trying to find you. I thought something had happened to you, thought my enemies had gotten to you because I'd been careless. When I couldn't find any trace, I thought maybe you'd gone back to Nigeria. I never stopped looking, Adana. Never stopped hoping I'd get a chance to explain, to make things right. She finally turned to face him, seeing the truth of it, written in the new lines on his face, in the shadows under his eyes. You broke me, she said simply. I was going to tell you I was pregnant that night. I had the tests in my purse. I was terrified and excited and sure that we'd figure it out together. And then I heard, you dismiss me like I was nothing, like everything between us had been a game. I'm sorry, Minho said, and the apology sounded like it was being torn from somewhere deep inside him. I'm so sorry, Adana. I was a coward. I thought I was protecting you by keeping our relationship secret, by lying when someone got suspicious, but all I did was hurt you. All I did was cost myself 3 years with you, with them, with our children. They're my children, she corrected. You're just a stranger who happens to share their DNA. Then let me become more than a stranger, he pleaded. Let me be their father. Let me be part of their lives. I'll do whatever you want, accept whatever boundaries you set. I'll grovel, I'll beg, I'll spend the rest of my life making up for what I did. Just please, please don't shut me out completely. Adana looked at him, at this powerful man reduced to begging in a hospital corridor, and felt something crack in the armor she'd built around her heart. She thought about Chizam asking about his father, about Amara's questions, about Dubem's innocent curiosity. They deserved to know him, didn't they? Even if she couldn't forgive him, even if the wounds he'd caused still bled, didn't her children deserve the chance to have a father? I need time, she said finally. I need time to think, to process this. You can visit them here, at the hospital, while Dubem recovers. But after that, I don't know. I need to figure out what's best for them. I'll take whatever you're willing to give, Minho said. Time. I can give you time. Over the next week, as Dubem gradually improved, Adana watched Kang Minho interact with his children. It was awkward at first. This powerful man clearly uncomfortable with the chaos that 3-year-olds brought to any situation. But he tried. He read them stories in Korean and mangled English, his accent making Dubem giggle. He played simple games with Chizam, who slowly warmed to this man who seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts. He listened with apparent fascination to Amara's rambling stories about her dolls and her friends at preschool, and he was patient in ways Adana had never seen him be. When Chizam threw a tantrum about finishing his vegetables, Minho didn't get angry or demanding. He simply waited it out, then calmly explained why vegetables were important. When Amara clung to him crying about a nightmare, he held her until she calmed, humming a Korean lullaby that Adana vaguely remembered from her early days in Seoul. When Dubem woke up disoriented and scared in the middle of the night, it was Minho who soothed him back to sleep, his voice gentle and reassuring. This version of him confused her. The Kang Minho she'd known had been controlled, powerful, sometimes tender but always with an edge of danger. This version, this father figure he was trying to become, seemed softer somehow, more human. She didn't know what to do with it, how to reconcile the man who'd broken her with the man who sang lullabies to their daughter. On the day Dubem was discharged, Minho appeared with a car and driver. I'd like to take you all home, he said. Make sure you get settled safely. Adana wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her independence, but she was exhausted, and the thought of managing 3 children on public transportation while carrying Dubem's medication and discharge paperwork seemed overwhelming. Okay, she agreed. The drive to her apartment in Incheon was quiet. The children, worn out from their week in the hospital, dozed in their car seats. Minho stared out the window, his jaw tight, and Adana wondered what he was thinking. When they arrived at her building, a modest structure in a working-class neighborhood, she saw him taking it all in, the cracked pavement, the aging exterior, the security that was more hopeful than effective. He helped her carry the children upstairs, and when she unlocked her apartment door, she was suddenly, painfully aware of how small it was, how shabby compared to his Hanamdong estate. The living room barely fit a couch and the children's toys. The kitchen was a narrow galley. The bedroom she shared with all 3 children had barely enough space for their beds. Minho set Dubem down gently on the couch, then stood in the middle of her living room looking lost. "This is where you've been living," he said. And it wasn't a question. "For 3 years, raising my children, this is what you could afford." "I manage," Adana said defensively. "It's not much, but it's ours. We're happy here. Are you?" He turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes was almost unbearable to witness. "Are you really happy, Adana? Or are you just surviving?" She wanted to lie, wanted to maintain her pride, but she was too tired for lies. "I'm surviving," she admitted, "and some days that's enough." "It shouldn't have to be," Minho said fiercely. "You shouldn't have to just survive. They shouldn't have to grow up like this. 3 children crammed into one bedroom, their mother working herself to exhaustion just to keep them fed. It's what we have," she replied simply. "Let me help," he said. "Not just with medical bills, but with everything. Let me find you a better apartment. Let me set up trust funds for the children. Let me take some of the burden off your shoulders." "I don't want your money," Adana said. "Then what do you want?" he asked. "Tell me what you want, Adana, and I'll do everything in my power to give it to you." She looked at him, at this man who'd broken her heart and was now offering her the world, and knew what she wanted, what she'd always wanted. "I want you to be real," she said quietly. "I want to know that this isn't just guilt or obligation. I want to know that if I let you into their lives, you won't disappear when it gets hard or inconvenient. I want to know that you actually want to be a father, not just play at it until the novelty wears off. I want to be their father," Minho said without hesitation. "I want to know them, to be part of their lives, to watch them grow up. I've missed 3 years already. I don't want to miss any more." "And me?" Adana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about me, Minho?" He crossed the small living room in 2 strides, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You," he said intently, "are the one who got away. The one I couldn't forget no matter how hard I tried. The one who made me feel human for the first time in years, and then vanished, taking that humanity with you. I don't deserve another chance with you, Adana. I know that, but I'm selfish enough to want one anyway. I don't know if I can trust you again," she admitted. "You hurt me, Minho. Badly. I know," he said, "and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worth trusting. However long it takes, whatever I need to do, I'll do it. Just don't shut me out completely, please." Adana closed her eyes, feeling tears threatening. She'd been so strong for so long, carrying everything alone, never admitting how much she needed help, how lonely she'd been. The temptation to lean on him, to accept what he was offering, was almost overwhelming, but fear held her back, the memory of that night 3 years ago still fresh enough to sting. "I need time," she said again. "Time to see if you mean what you say. Time to figure out if this is real or just another convenient arrangement. I'll give you all the time you need," Minho promised. "But I'm not going anywhere, Adana. Not this time." True to his word, Kang Minho became a constant presence in their lives over the following months. He showed up every weekend without fail, taking the children to parks and museums, teaching them Korean traditions, introducing them to parts of their heritage they'd never experienced. He never pushed Adana, never demanded more than she was willing to give, but he was always there, patient and persistent. He fixed things in her apartment that had been broken for years, the leaky faucet and the window that wouldn't close properly, and the temperamental heating system. He didn't ask permission, just showed up with tools and made her life a little easier. When her car broke down and she couldn't afford the repairs, she found it fixed and returned to her parking space with a note that simply said, "You need reliable transportation for the children." Adana wanted to be angry about his high-handed methods, but the truth was, life was easier with his help. She could breathe a little more, worry a little less. The children adored him, which made everything more complicated. Chizam, who'd been so protective and suspicious at first, now ran to Minho when he arrived, eager to show him drawings or tell him about school. Amara called him Appa when she thought Adana wasn't listening, and the joy on Minho's face every time nearly broke her heart. Even Dubem, who barely remembered being sick, had attached himself to his father with the innocent trust of a child who'd never been betrayed. But Adana held back, keeping her heart carefully guarded even as Minho dismantled her defenses piece by piece. She couldn't afford to be hurt again, couldn't risk falling for him only to discover it was all an elaborate act. So she watched, she waited, she tested him in small ways, looking for cracks in his commitment. The cracks never appeared. Minho was rock steady, showing up even when the children were sick and cranky, even when Adana herself was exhausted and short-tempered. He learned to braid Amara's hair after watching YouTube tutorials, practiced reading children's books in English to improve his pronunciation, memorized their favorite foods and their fears and their dreams. 6 months after their reunion, Adana woke up in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming, but then she heard the crackling and saw the orange glow under her bedroom door. Fire. The apartment was on fire. Terror, unlike anything she'd ever experienced, flooded her system. The children. She had to get the children out. She scooped up Dubem from his bed, screaming for Chizam and Amara to wake up. The smoke was already thick, making her eyes water and her lungs burn. She could hear sirens in the distance, but they seemed impossibly far away. Adana managed to get the children to the front door, but when she tried to open it, the handle was burning hot. The hallway must be fully engulfed. She turned back, her mind racing, remembering something about wet towels and staying low, and oh God, they were going to die here. She was going to lose her children to this fire, and Minho would never forgive her, and they'd never gotten the chance to try again. Then the window shattered, glass exploding inward, and Kang Minho was climbing through, his suit torn and his face streaked with soot. He moved with the kind of focused intensity she remembered from the office, scooping up Amara and Chisom with practiced efficiency. "The fire escape," he said. "Can you make it with Dubem?" "Yes," she managed, and then they were climbing out the window, down the metal stairs that groaned under their weight, and the fresh air hit her lungs like a blessing. Below, firefighters were setting up, and Minho was handing the children down to them one by one, making sure they were safe before finally helping Adana down. Her legs gave out once she was on solid ground, adrenaline deserting her all at once. Minho caught her, held her up, and she realized he was shaking too. This powerful man who feared nothing reduced to tremors by the thought of losing them. "You came," she said stupidly. "How did you know?" "I have alerts set up," he said, his voice rough from smoke or emotion. "Any emergency call from this address notifies me immediately. I was here in 10 minutes. You saved us," Adana whispered. "You saved our children." "I almost lost you," he replied, and there were tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on his face. "I almost lost all of you. Adana, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending that I'm okay with boundaries and time and slow reconciliation. I love you. I've loved you since the night you showed up drunk at my door 3 years ago. I loved you when you disappeared. I loved you when I couldn't find you. I love you now, covered in soot and ash. Please, please let me back in. Let me be part of this family completely." Adana looked at him, at this man who'd raced through fire for them, who'd spent 6 months proving his commitment, who was crying openly with no regard for the firefighters and neighbors watching, and something in her chest that had been closed for 3 years finally cracked open. "Okay," she said. "Okay, Minho. Yes." He kissed her then, in front of everyone, tasting like smoke and tears and hope. The children, being checked over by paramedics nearby, noticed and started cheering. And Adana, who'd been so afraid to trust again, let herself fall into the kiss, into the promise of what they could become. The fire had started from faulty wiring in the apartment below hers, an accident that could have killed them all. Minho refused to let them go back even after the building was deemed structurally sound. Instead, he moved them into his Hanamdong estate, this time not as a secret but as his acknowledged family. The children adapted with the resilience of youth, thrilled by the space and the gardens and the fact that they each got their own bedroom. Adana took longer to adjust. Being in the house where everything had started, walking the same halls where she'd fallen in love and had her heart broken, brought up complicated emotions. But Minho was patient, giving her time to heal even as they navigated this new life together. He taught Chizom and Dubem Taekwondo, instilling discipline and confidence. He attended every one of Amara's dance recitals, sitting in the front row and clapping louder than anyone. He learned to cook Nigerian food, properly, finally mastering jollof rice after dozens of failed attempts. He went to parent-teacher conferences and doctor's appointments and birthday parties, showing up for all the mundane moments that made up a life. And slowly, carefully, he courted Adana all over again. Date nights where he took her to restaurants she'd only dreamed of affording. Long conversations about their future, about the consulting firm she still wanted to start, and how he could help make that dream a reality. Quiet moments after the children were asleep, when they sat together and remembered who they'd been to each other, who they could be again. It wasn't perfect. They argued about his continued involvement in the underworld, about the dangers his lifestyle posed to their children. They disagreed about discipline and education and 1,000 small things that all parents fought about. But they talked through it, compromised, found ways to merge their different backgrounds and expectations into something that worked. A year after the fire, Minho proposed properly, not with grand gestures but simply, quietly, in the kitchen where they'd first kissed. "Marry me," he said, "not because of the children, not out of obligation, but because I want to spend the rest of my life with you, because you make me better, because I love you." Adana said yes. The wedding was small, intimate, a blend of Korean and Nigerian traditions that celebrated both their cultures. The children were ring bearers and flower girls, and when Chisom accidentally dropped the rings and Dubem chased them under a table while Amara lectured them both about responsibility, Adana and Minho just laughed, because this was their life now, chaotic and imperfect, and exactly what they needed. Standing in the rain after the ceremony, Adana leaned into her husband's warmth and watched their children play. She thought about the night she'd fled his estate pregnant and heartbroken, certain she'd never survive the pain. She thought about the 3 years of struggling alone, convinced she'd made the right choice in running. She thought about how close they'd come to never finding each other again. Sometimes love didn't return the way it left, she realized. Sometimes it came back stronger, deeper, tested by fire and time and the 1,000 small choices that made up a life. Sometimes broken things, when carefully mended, became more beautiful than they'd ever been whole. Minho pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "None," she replied, and meant it. Not even one. In the end, Kang Minho and Adana Okafor had built something that shouldn't have been possible. A family forged from betrayal and redemption, from mistakes and second chances, from 2 broken people who'd found healing in each other. It wasn't the love story either of them had imagined, but it was theirs, messy and real and worth every moment of pain it had taken to get there. And as the rain fell softly around them, washing away the last remnants of ash and sorrow, they stood together facing whatever came next, no longer alone, but whole.